In the late 18th century, a series of events unfolded in France that transformed the political scene in the world. These events, which began in 1789 and to some extent concluded in 1799, are famously known as the period of the French Revolution. Although this period lasted just over a decade, it encompassed a chaotic range of events from oppression and revolution to war and coup attempts. In this video, we aim to provide a brief overview of these turbulent 10 years. Stay tuned. From the 17th century and the onset of the Age of the Enlightenment, the political and social scene in Europe witnessed fundamental and substantial changes. Knowledge and science, which had been almost exclusive to certain classes, brought issues such as human rights to the forefront of significant segments of society. However, despite these discussions prevailing within the community, the social and political structure remained predominantly traditional. This conflict existed in France as well and intensified over time. Notably, as in the 18th century, the country experienced an unprecedented population growth leading to a significant demographic imbalance against the aristocracy. Moreover, by the late century, the economic situation in the country had worsened significantly. Prolonged wars and competition with Britain, especially France's support for the American Revolution, imposed heavy financial burdens on the government. On the other hand, the traditional tax system, with various exemptions granted to the clergy and the nobility, effectively shifted the burden on the shoulders of the weaker and ordinary classes. In addition to all the previously mentioned issues, France experienced an extremely harsh winter in 1789, resulting in practical difficulties in providing food supplies for its people. Severe dissatisfaction among the people, local uprisings, and the government's inability to address these problems led to Louis XVI, the King of France, after a hiatus of 175 years, issuing an order to convene the Estates General of France on May 5, 1789. Most historians consider this point as the beginning of the French Revolution. The Estates General, a legislative and advisory assembly consisting of 3 estates, the clergy, nobility, and commoners, was formed. Each of these estates held separate sessions, and ultimately, opinions endorsed by at least 2 estates could be transformed into law. Consequently, the clergy and nobility could impose their opinions on the commoners. This was despite the fact that commoners represented over 95% of the French population, while the other 2 groups accounted for less than 5%. Leveraging the changing values and intellectual shifts that had emerged in Europe, representatives of the commoners, in protest against the existing structure, in June 1789 announced the establishment of the National Assembly. They intended to have equal voting rights in the new structure and therefore invited representatives from the other 2 states to participate in their sessions. To prevent the formation of the new assembly, Louis ordered the closure of the building where the Estates General was to convene, located near his palace in Versailles. However, the National Assembly members were determined, and they held their inaugural session in a nearby tennis court, where they pledged not to disband until a new constitutional law was established. Gradually, some representatives from the other 2 states, especially the clergy, also joined the National Assembly, making the work more serious. The relocation of National Assembly's meeting place from Versailles to Paris symbolically shifted the main center of power from Versailles and the royal court to Paris and the presence of representatives of the general public. In July, rumors spread that Louis intended to shut down the National Assembly. This news threw France, particularly Paris, into chaos. People took to the street in support of the National Assembly, and after several days of confrontation on July 14th, they finally stormed the Bastille fortress, gaining access to its armaments and weapons. This event marked a turning point, and from then on, for perhaps a decade, violent and fierce conflicts became part of the daily life of the French people. In August, the National Assembly issued a series of decrees that effectively ended the feudal system in France. Additionally, laws promoting equality before the law, abolishing privileges belonging to the aristocracy, and granting freedom of thought and religion were passed. Finally, in late August, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted by the National Assembly, providing a more comprehensive shape to these rights. While these changes reshaped France's legal and social structure, the most significant problem persisted: poverty and food shortages. This issue led to thousands of women staging protests in Paris in October. When news spread that a few days earlier a lavish party had been held at Versailles Palace, an angry crowd marched toward Versailles and besieged the palace. Louis XVI, along with his wife Marie Antoinette, was forced to surrender and was then relocated from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. From the beginning, there were different opinions within the National Assembly. One group sought an end to the monarchy, while another, more conservative, aimed to maintain it. At the suggestion of the head of the National Assembly, the first group sat on the left and the second group on the right. Thus, the concept that is still relevant today, dividing political parties and groups into left and right, was born. Due to these internal disagreements, although the National Assembly succeeded in nullifying the traditional structure, it struggled to establish a new constitutional framework. This situation led to turmoil and unrest in most cities of France. However, Paris, with its Paris Commune structure, to some extent was an exception to this rule, maintaining relative peace in the city. Nearly 2 years passed in this manner. In June 1791, under the influence of his brother and wife, Louis XVI decided to flee France and regain power with the support of other monarchies and his loyalists abroad. However, this escape was unsuccessful and he was returned to Paris and Tuileries Palace. This event further weakened Louis' position and supporters of ending the monarchy increased. Nevertheless, they still didn't have the upper hand, and in September a new constitution was approved, replacing the National Assembly with the Legislative Assembly. Members of the Legislative Assembly were divided into 3 groups from the outset. The smallest group consisted of left-wing defenders of republicanism who believed the revolution was progressing too slowly. The next group was completely opposed to the first and believed the revolution was moving too fast. However, the majority of the representatives were in between these 2 groups and, depending on the situation, voted alongside one of the 2 previous groups. The radicals, who gradually became known as Jacobins, although consisting less than 1/5 of the assembly, had a louder voice and with the support they garnered from the people, assumed many key responsibilities in practice. From the early days, neighboring monarchies held a hostile position toward the French Revolution, especially Austria, whose ruler was Marie Antoinette's brother. Support for anti-revolutionary uprising in France and the sheltering of revolution opponents in their countries sensitized the French to this issue. Finally, after some deliberation, on April 20, 1792, the Legislative Assembly officially declared war against Austria and Prussia. In August, Parisians learned that foreign governments aimed to support Louis and reinstate him in power. This news incited revolutionary anger and provided grounds for the Legislative Assembly on August 10th to officially depose Louis XVI. On September 22nd, the new assembly called the National Convention voted to change the regime from a monarchy to a republic. Immediately, investigations into Louis XVI's crimes began. After months of debates, Louis was deemed a traitor and was finally executed by guillotine on January 17, 1793. The execution of Louis XVI intensified the radical atmosphere in France. On the other hand, more countries joined the war against France and the situation did not improve at all. Economic dissatisfaction led to uprisings almost daily. To manage the insecurity, the revolutionaries established a committee known as the Committee of Public Safety. However, as tensions and conflicts escalated on one side and the rise of more radical revolutionaries on the other, the newly written constitution after the establishment of the Republic was set aside and all power came under the authority of this committee. Thus, from July 1793, the Committee of Public Safety became the government of France. The Committee of Public Safety, especially under the influence of Robespierre, one of the leaders of the revolution, acted aggressively throughout France, and individuals, from charges of profiteering to suspicion of betrayal, easily found themselves facing the guillotine. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, had tens of thousands of victims. Marie Antoinette, the wife of the Louis XVI, was one of these individuals. Due to her excessive indulgence in luxuries, amid France's dire economic conditions, she was even more hated among the people than her husband. It was famous that she allegedly responded to the news of the people's lacking bread by saying, "Let them eat cake." However, it later became evident that Marie Antoinette had never made this statement, yet the revolutionary fury left no room for fairness. Nevertheless, the victims of the Reign of Terror was not limited to the king's associates. Many revolutionaries were also executed during this period. Perhaps the most famous of these individuals was Georges Danton, one of the renowned and relatively radical leaders of the French Revolution who lost his life due to his opposition to Robespierre's excessive violence. The threats of execution against some members of the National Convention led to Robespierre's arrest in July 1794. 2 days later, on July 28, he, along with dozens of his followers, was executed by guillotine, thus concluding the Reign of Terror in France. After a period of turmoil and vengeance, tensions began to diminish in mid-1795. France managed to achieve peace in some areas, and the Third Constitution was enacted after the revolution's victory. The new constitution entrusted the governance of the country to a 5-member committee known as the Directory of France. Though tensions and revolts still existed during this period, compared to the Reign of Terror, the streets and cities of France experienced more tranquility. However, political tensions were exceedingly high. The competition between loyalists to the monarchy and radical revolutionaries practically halted the government's activity, causing a standstill. This situation forced the Directory to resort to military to advance its agendas. One of the military commanders who had shone in the war was Napoleon Bonaparte. After several years of turmoil, on November 9, 1799, with the assistance of Sieyès and Docou, Napoleon staged a coup in Paris and seized power. The new government, known as the Consulate of France, disregarded much of the revolutionary heritage, paving the way for the establishment of Napoleon's empire in 1804. According to most historians, the coup on November 9th, also known as the 18th Brumaire, marked the endpoint of the French Revolution. In this video, we have delved into the chaotic era of the French Revolution. If you found the content informative, please like it and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to share your thoughts, comments, and ideas for future topics in the comment section. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.